Hello and welcome to this video on pest control for your bonsai. When we've spoken about bonsai species in our playlist on the Bonsai Species Guide, pests are often relegated towards the end as most pest control is either minimal or fairly generic, like a Call of Duty game, a White Girl Starbucks order, or a Marvel movie. This is not to say all pest control is so straightforward. Common pests that affect your bonsai will be things like aphids, mites, scale, mold, and so on. And then we have fungi, nematodes, and parasitic organisms, and there are many diverse issues, and the challenges are diverse. While some are very easily resolved, others are much more difficult. And to start with, we can talk about mechanical or physical ways to control pests. This is something you can do, say, while checking your bonsai or doing pruning, wiring, and so on. And the first is fairly obvious, picking them off with your hands. This works just fine for things like caterpillars and beetles. After all, they're fairly obvious, they're fairly large, and you can get to them while you're doing most of your normal stuff. Normal stuff in terms of, say, checking the bonsai ideally every few days, if not weekly. And this is more pronounced during spring and summer when these same pests are arguably, let's say, more prevalent. Not necessarily the most prevalent time frame, depending on what we're talking about, but arguably perhaps the best time to do it. Then we have water spraying. This is literally just a water bottle or a spray bottle with a narrow nozzle on it and literally squirt them to knock them off. This is effective for things like aphids and spider mites. It's also particularly difficult to do in some cases, depending on the kind of bottle and spray bottle you're using, if they're on the underside of leaves, as sometimes having to do this upside down is just not feasible. Then you have the same sort of idea, but applying it to particularly fungal infections, although not necessarily as effective in doing so. The only problem with it is that although you do this every few days, you need to make sure that your bonsai tree dries out in terms of the bottom of the leaves completely between attempts to remove it. And then we have brushing. And this is much like picking them off your hands and spraying with a water bottle, except you use a dry brush, and particularly good for scale and mealybugs. You take, say, a small paintbrush, a toothbrush, or anything really similar, and you put a little bit of alcohol on it, and you gently scrub at the affected area. This should break down any waxy coatings and kill them. Now, you can do this without the alcohol initially to try and get rid of them mechanically, and then use the alcohol approach. You do want to wash the bonsai tree afterwards, mostly to avoid any alcohol that remains on that particular part of the tree. Then we have traps. Traps are arguably one of the more convenient options, but understand that they are very limited in their use, and they are rather obviously another consumable, and they're obviously not going to deal with anything that's already on your bonsai. You want to place your sticky traps or whatever nearby the bonsai, and these will catch flying insects, or pests. White flies and fungal gnats are the more common options. The physical barriers are the next option, and these are generally going to be something like, say, fine mesh that protects against larger pests like caterpillars, butterflies, birds, and similar. This is important to use, particularly if you're in areas where you have birds, say, digging away at your moss covering your bonsai, because that is one of the most frustrating things in the world. Just be aware that you don't want it blocking airflow, which, if you're using a mesh, shouldn't happen, but there's always a risk there. And finally, we have soil covers, which again are there to help protect the tree, but also prevent various pests from digging around in the soil. Now, moss is okay for a lot of things, but it doesn't always work. Gravel is generally a better option in that respect, but even then it's somewhat frustrating because birds particularly will do so, but it will stop fungal gnats in particular that will lay their eggs in your soil. Next we have biological approaches. The first of these is going to make the various, let's say, organic individuals and those who believe in permaculture absolutely ecstatic, use natural predators or microorganisms.
And by the way, you don't want to do that either. You think you do, but you don't.
These are basically your eco-friendly options for bonsai grown indoors particularly, but also outside. So ladybugs, for example, will eat aphids, scale, and mealybugs, so they're pretty useful. Now, the downside to this is you'll have to release your predators. So this is not quite Jurassic Park or similar, but letting loose the ladybugs of war doesn't really carry the same gravitas. And secondary to that is actually culturing them or growing them. But you can just rely on nature to do this. If you aren't relying on nature, you can instead release them, but only in the early morning or evening. This is when they're both most active and able to get to where they need to go. You want to release about 20 or so ladybugs per bonsai, if not arguably more again. The best place to do this is inside a greenhouse, because not only will they not be able to fly very far, but even if they do leave the bonsai, they will eventually come back. And then we have predatory mites. These are useful for spider mite infestations, as the various predatory mites will basically catch them, eat them, and clear out the tree, and they shouldn't do any harm to your bonsai in the process. The catch to this is that they need high humidity, and this is great for, say, tropical species like fig trees, not so great for a lot of other species where you now have to deal with mold. So you'll fix one problem and create another. And finally we have lacewing. Lacewing larvae will consume aphids, and so they're a particularly useful option. Just be aware that you want to do this in a very controlled environment. Microbial options are another way to do this, but this is a little more difficult. Sometimes you can do this, sometimes it's not so practical, but you can use, say, bacterial pesticides that are effective against caterpillars and similar, but they don't cause any harm to the actual plant itself. BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, is a common example of this. It's useful because you just spray it on the tree, and this should kill off all the, let's say, unwanted pests that you have there. It's useful for soft body pests like aphids and whiteflies along with caterpillars, but just be aware that you want to avoid overusing it for a range of reasons, not least of which is that it can avoid, let's say, infection with these pests, but it can create other issues. The biological approach is arguably something useful, and it should, if you're doing this in, say, a greenhouse, require minimal maintenance once you start it, as it should be reasonably self-sustaining. But the other noteworthy thing here is that although you are effectively solving one issue, unless that issue is at least somewhat sustained, your solution won't be sustainable, because in many cases it will simply run out of food. So you don't want to have biological controls and chemical controls used at the same time, and we'll get to chemical controls in a minute. Strictly speaking though, if you are going to do chemical controls and you want to use biological methods, you want to wait 2 weeks between each. In terms of chemical control, well, we literally have a less, let's say, natural, to be very vague about this, pesticides. And these are used particularly for delicate bonsai, where you don't really have any way to deal with it otherwise. For example, you can use soap. Now, this is helpful because soap is relatively, and we say relatively for a very good reason, benign in terms of what it does to your bonsai, but it will get rid of things like aphids, spider mites, and mealybugs. You then have, say, timing and application, which that one's a little more, let's say, difficult, as you want to try and do so in the very early morning in order to avoid leaf burn from sunlight, as you are applying soap in water, and that soapy water will act as a magnifying glass and any sunlight will cause it to burn. You only do so roughly once a week, and you do so over about a month time frame. In terms of some species though, some, let's say, can be, let's say, susceptible, is perhaps the best word for this, and also for those species that have to do with photosynthesis, it is a problem, so just be aware of it. And then you have neem oil, which is it's called natural, but it's sort of not, a pesticide and fungicide. So this is a all-round application and is useful for most everything. There are some exceptions, but it is useful. You apply it against aphids, scale, spider mites, and powdery mildew, and it's only a small amount. It's 1 or 2 teaspoons in roughly a liter, up to more again, of water. And this is roughly 1 to 2 teaspoons in a quarter of water. You want to add a few drops of dish soap to this as well, as it will help with the neem oil mixing with the water. It acts as an emulsifier. You basically take this and treat it like a soldier in Vietnam, and you spray everything, effectively burning out any pests. The only difference is that, unlike Vietnam, there are no children involved, we hope. Neem oil is useful because, well, it works well, but much like anything that's based on water or has water as a carrier, avoid using in direct sunlight and ideally give your bonsai plenty of time to dry out between applications. You then have horticultural oils. Some of these are more direct and very clear than others, and they quite literally smother or suffocate any pests you have to deal with. Scale and mealybugs are particularly common examples. They're generally a very lightweight oil, and so are helpful, but they do leave some residue behind, so that's the only issue here. It's also helpful in terms of it provides a longer term form of protection. Rather than being, say, 1 or 2 days, it will last out several days at least. Several more days anyway. And finally we have, let's say, more synthetic pesticides. Anyway, these are used for just about everything, but particularly commonly applied to, say, root aphids and persistent scale issues. And what you do is you just drench your bonsai with them. Now, each individual manufacturer will have different ways to do this, but in general you only use it once per growing season. So you don't need to worry so much about it poisoning your tree as long as you follow the directions. Just be aware that there are some concerns with that, and more so with bonsai that develop anything edible, because you rather obviously can't eat what's been treated this way. Safety is, well, safety. Do the common sense. Wear a face mask, wear eye protection, wear hand protection. None of this should be that surprising if you have, well, common sense, but that's not so common anymore. If we're going to take everything we've spoken about so far, you can sort of approach it somewhat holistically. It's called integrated pest management, and you take all of the above methods, and what you do is you identify your pest. You can do this either through, say, somebody knowing what they're looking at, the various online resources, certain apps will allow you to confirm what you're looking at, and so on. Check what damage they've caused, and then choose what is going to be the least invasive and harmful method. You're basically doing the escalation of force, except unlike most escalation of force we see, it doesn't involve shooting someone in the end and police. You then want to check and adjust treatment on the fly. This is generally done after about a week to see how much harm has been done to the pests, and ideally all the harm, and how much has been done to your bonsai, which ideally is none of the harm. If this doesn't happen, you obviously go on to the next method, and you keep a track record of what's happening. This is particularly important if you find that you have a recurring problem with particular pests, and you can track down what's going on. As a sort of cheat sheet of common and quick and easy solutions, particularly for the most frequent pest you'll encounter, you have aphids. And these are dealt with simply using water and spraying it, sometimes insecticidal soaps, and all ladybugs.
Feed me!
Spider mites are literally tiny spiders. You deal with these by reducing humidity. You use predatory mites and neem oil if it comes to that. Scale is a little more difficult because it has a waxy cover on it, but it is relatively immobile. You can basically deal with this with alcohol, like most problems. Alcohol will solve everything. If not that, horticultural oil will also work. Mealybugs are small cottony pests, and they generally harm the leaves. This again is alcohol, which again solves everything, along with insecticidal soap. Caterpillars are most easily removed by hand, and if that doesn't work and you, say, have a large bonsai collection, a BT may be your best option. And finally, fungal gnats. These are going to be small flies, they live in soil. You just reduce watering, use sticky traps, and in some cases you may need a soil drench or neem oil. There are some considerations, particularly when we talk about bonsai and pest control, in that bonsai do have some, let's say, unique vulnerabilities. Now, pine bonsai are particularly prone to needle scale, and tropical figs attract mealybugs. So different species of bonsai tree will have more significant concerns. Also, location-wise, if you're keeping your bonsai indoors, which you shouldn't do for most species, you face higher risks of spider mites due to the difference in humidity. Whereas if they're outside, you tend to encounter more, let's say, wild or insect-based problems, caterpillars, beetles, etc. Then we have seasons. As we mentioned earlier, some seasons are worse than others for these different pests. And lastly, we have tree and age. The age is generally associated with size, but not always. Sometimes very old trees are kept very small, Other times very small trees are very new, and other times very small trees are very, very new. It really does go with what you're trying to achieve. Because of this, young or recently repotted bonsai tend to be more vulnerable to various pests. So you don't want to use something systemic, most of the time, on weakened trees after they've been repotted. You want to be as minimally invasive and as minimally aggressive as you can for as long as you can after repotting. After 3 to 6 months, you can probably start doing something more. By combining preventive care, carefully monitoring your bonsai, and targeting what you're doing about each pest, you can effectively manage pests with bonsai, while typically keeping them healthy and attractive. However, sometimes it is very much worthwhile consulting somebody who is something at least of a specialist in terms of pest management if you have a particular bonsai species or you're finding that your current approaches just aren't up to the task. In that case, it may be an issue to do with what you're using, the pest itself, or possibly even the bonsai. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.